Chapter 6 of David Elginbrod. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit www.librivox.org. David Elginbrod, Chapter 6. The Laird's Lady. Ye archwives standeth at the fence, sin ye been strong, as is a great camele, ne suffer not that men you don offence. And slender wives fell as in battail, beth eager as is a tiger yond in Ind. I clappeth as a mill, I you conseil. Chaucer, The Clerk's Tale. The length and frequency of Hugh's absences, careless as she was of his presence, had already attracted the attention of Mrs. Glassford, and very little trouble had to be expended on the discovery of his haunt; for the servants knew well enough where he went, and of course had come to their own conclusions as to the object of his visits. So the lady chose to think it her duty to expostulate with Hugh on the subject. Accordingly, one morning after breakfast, the laird having gone to mount his horse, and the boys to have a few minutes' play before lessons, Mrs. Glassford, who had kept her seat at the head of the table, waiting for the opportunity, turned towards Hugh, who sat reading the week's news, folded her hands on the tablecloth, drew herself up yet a little more stiffly in her chair, and thus addressed him: "It's my duty, Mr. Sutherland, seeing ye have no mother to look after ye." Hugh expected something matronly about his linen or his socks, and put down his newspaper with a smile; but to his astonishment she went on: "To remonstrate with ye on the impropriety of going so often to David Elginbrod's. They're not company for a young gentleman like you, Mr. Sutherland." "They're good company enough for a poor tutor, Mrs. Glassford," replied Hugh, foolishly enough. "Not at all, not at all," insisted the lady. "With your connections—" "Good gracious! Who ever said anything about my connections? I never pretended to have any." Hugh was getting angry already. Mrs. Glassford nodded her head significantly, as much as to say, "I know more about you than you imagine," and then went on: "Your mother will never forgive me if you get into a scrape with that smooth-faced hussy; and if her father, honest man, hasn't eyes enough in his head, other people have; ay, and tongues too, Mr. Sutherland." Hugh was on the point of forgetting his manners, and consigning all the above-mentioned organs to perdition; but he managed to restrain his wrath, and merely said that Margaret was one of the best girls he had ever known, and that there was no possible danger of any kind of scrape with her. This mode of argument, however, was not calculated to satisfy Mrs. Glassford. She returned to the charge. "She's a sly puss, with her shy airs and graces. Her father's just daft with conceit of her, and it's no to be surprised if she cast a glamour ower you. Mr. Sutherland, you're but young yet." Hugh's pride presented any alliance with a lassie who had herded the laird's cows barefoot, and even now tended their own cow, as an all but inconceivable absurdity; and he resented, more than he could have thought possible, the entertainment of such a degrading idea in the mind of Mrs. Glassford. Indignation prevented him from replying, while she went on, getting more vernacular as she proceeded: "It's no for lack of company 'at ye're driven to seek theirs, I'm sure. There's twa as fine lads as good scholars as ye'll find in the haill kintryside, no to mention the laird and mysel'." But Hugh could bear it no longer, nor would he condescend to excuse or explain his conduct. "Madam, I beg you will not mention this subject again." "But I will mention it, Mr. Sutherland; and if ye'll nae listen to reason, I'll go to them 'at maun do't." "I am accountable to you, madam, for my conduct in your house, and for the way in which I discharge my duty to your children. No further." "Do ye ca' that dischargin' your duty to my bairns? To set them the example of hingin' at a quean's apron strings, and fillin' your lug wi' idle havers? Ca' ye that dischargin' your duty? My certie, a bonny dischargin'!" "I never see the girl but in her father and mother's presence." "Weel, weel, Mr. Sutherland," said Mrs. Glassford, in a final tone, and trying to smother the anger which she felt had allowed to carry her further than was decorous, "we'll say nae mair aboot it at present; but I maun just speak to the laird himsel', and see what he says till it." And with this threat she walked out of the room in what she considered a dignified manner. Hugh was exceedingly annoyed at this treatment, and thought at first of throwing up his situation at once. But he got calmer by degrees, and saw that it would be to his own loss, and perhaps to the injury of his friends at the cottage. So he took his revenge by recalling the excited face of Mrs. Glassford, whose nose had got as red with passion as the protuberance of a turkey-cock when gobbling out its unutterable feelings of disdain. He dwelt upon this soothing contemplation till a fit of laughter relieved him, and he was able to go and join his pupils as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, the lady sent for David, who was at work in the garden, into no less an audience-chamber than the drawing-room, the revered abode of all the tutelar deities of the house, chief amongst which were the portraits of the Laird and herself. He plethoric, and wrapped in voluminous folds of neckerchief; she long-necked and lean and bare-shouldered. The original of the latter work of art seated herself in the most important chair in the room, and when David, after carefully wiping the shoes he had already wiped 3 times on his way up, entered with a respectful but nowise obsequious bow, she ordered him, with the air of an empress, to shut the door. When he had obeyed, she ordered him, in a similar tone, to be seated, for she sought to mingle condescension and conciliation with severity. "David," she then began, "I am informed that ye keep open door to our Mr. Sutherland, and that he spends most fortnights in your company." "Weel, mem, it's verra true," was all David's answer. He sat in an expectant attitude. "Dawvid, I wonner at ye," returned Mrs. Glassford, forgetting her dignity, and becoming confidentially remonstrative. "He's a young gentleman of talons, with ilka prospect of wagging his head in pulpit some day, and ye aid at abet him at idling away his time in your chimna log, doing waur nor naething ava. I'm surprised at ye, Dawvid. I thought ye mair sense." David looked out of his clear, blue, untroubled eyes upon the ruffled countenance of his mistress, with an almost paternal smile. "Weel, mem, I maun say I dinna just think the young man's in the warst of company when he's at our ingle neuk; and for idling of his time awa', it's weel ward for himsel', forby for us, gin holy words binna lees." "What do you mean, Dawvid?" said the lady, rather sharply, for she loved no riddles. "I mean this, mem, that the young man is just actin' the part of Peter and John at the bonny gate of the temple, when they said, 'Such as I have, give I thee;' and gin it be more blessed to give than to receive, as St. Paul said, as the Master himself said the young man 'ill no be the waur off in his own learning, that he imparts of it to them that hunger for it." "You mean by this, Dawvid, gin ye could express yourself to the point, 'at the young man what's ower weel paid to instruct my bairns, neglects them, and lays himself oot upon other folk's weans, who have no right to ettle aboon the station in which their Maker put them.'" This was uttered with quite a religious fervour of expostulation, for the lady's natural indignation at the thought of Meg Elginbrod having lessons from her boy's tutor was cowed beneath the quiet, steady gaze of the noble-minded peasant father. "He lays himself oot mair upon the other folk themselves than upon their weans, mem; though nae doubt my Maggie comes in for a good share. But for neglectin' of his duty to you, mem, I'm sure I kenna who that can be; for it was only yestreen 'at the laird himsel' said to me 'at hoo the bairns had never gotten on nothing like it with any other body." "The laird's ower ready with clevers," quoth the laird's wife, nettled to find herself in the wrong, and forgetful of her own and her lord's dignity at once. "But," she pursued, "all I can say is, that I consider it very improper of you, with a young lass bairn, to encourage this nichtly visits of a young gentleman, who's so far aboon her in station, and doubtless will some day be farther yet." "Mem," said David, with dignity, "I'm willin' no to understan' what ye mean. My Maggie's no one 'at needs lookin' after, and a body had need to be careful and no interfere wi' the Lord's herdin', for he calls himself the shepherd of the sheep; and while I lo'e her, I maun leave him to lead them who follow him wherever he goeth. She'll no be ill guided, and I'm no going to keep her at ilka turn." "Weel, weel, that's yer ain affair, Dawvid, my man. rejoined Mrs. Glassford, with rising voice and complexion. "And that I have to add is just this, 'at as long as my tutor visits her—" "He visits her no more than me, ma'am," interposed David; but his mistress went on, with dignified disregard of the interruption: "visits her, I cannot, for the sake of my own bairns, and the morals of my hoosehold, employ her aboot the house, as I was in the way of doing before. Good morning, Dawvid. I'll speak to the laird himsel', since ye'll no heed me." "It's more to my lassie, ma'am, excuse me, to learn to the understandin' the works of her Maker, than it is to be employed in your household. Mony thanks, ma'am, for what ye have done, and in that way, and good morning to ye, ma'am. I'm sorry we should have any misunderstandin', but I cannot help it for my part." With these words, David withdrew, rather anxious about the consequences to Hugh of this unpleasant interference on the part of Mrs. Glassford. That lady's wrath kept warm without much nursing, till the laird came home, when she turned the whole of her battery upon him, and kept up a steady fire until he yielded, and promised to turn his upon David. But he had more common sense than his wife in some things, and saw at once how ridiculous it would be to treat the affair as of importance. So the next time he saw David, he addressed himself half jocularly: "Weel, Dawvid, you and the mistress have been having a bit of a dispute thegither, eh?" "Weel, sir, we war not altogether of the same mind," said David, with a smile. "Weel, we maun hummer her, ye ken, or it may be the waur for us all, ye ken." And the laird nodded with humorous significance. "I'm sure I sud be glad, sir; but this is no sma' matter to me and my Maggie, for we're jist goin' food for the verra soul, sir, from him at his books." "Cudna ye be content wi' the books, without the man, Dawvid?" "We sud mak but sma' progress, sir, that get." The laird began to be a little nettled himself at David's stiffness about such a small matter, and held his peace. David resumed: "Besides, sir, that's a matter for the young man to settle, and no for me. It would ill become me, after all he's done, for us to steek the door in his face. Na, as long as I have a door to hold open, it's no to be steekit to him." "After all, the door's mine, Dawvid," said the laird. "As long as I'm in your hoose, and in your service, sir, the door's mine," retorted David, quietly. The laird turned and rode away without another word. What passed between him and his wife never transpired. Nothing more was said to Hugh as long as he remained at Turriepuffit. But Margaret was never sent for to the house after this, upon any occasion whatever. The laird gave her a nod as often as he saw her, but the lady, if they chanced to meet, took no notice of her. Margaret, on her part, stood or passed with her eyes on the ground, and no further change of countenance than a slight flush of discomfort. The lessons went on as usual, and happy hours they were for all those concerned. Often, in after years, and in far different circumstances, the thoughts of Hugh reverted with a painful yearning to the dim lighted cottage, with its clay floor and its deal table, to the earnest pair seated with him at the labours that unfold the motions of the stars, and even to the homely, thick-set, but active form of Janet, and that peculiar smile of hers, with which, after an apparently snappish speech, spoken with her back to the person addressed, she would turn round her honest face half apologetically, and shine full upon some one or other of the three, with whom she honoured with her whole heart and soul, and who, she feared, might be offended at what she called her home or fashion of speaking. Indeed, it was wonderful what a share the motherhood of this woman, incapable as she was of entering into the intellectual occupations of the others, had in producing that sense of home blessedness, which enwrapped Hugh also in the folds of its hospitality, and drew him towards its heart. Certain it is that not one of the three would have worked so well without the sense of the presence of Janet, here and there about the room, or in the immediate neighbourhood of it. Love watching over labour. Once a week, always on Saturday nights, Hugh stayed to supper with them, and on these occasions Janet contrived to have something better than ordinary in honour of their guest. Still, it was of the homeliest country fare, such as Hugh could partake of without the least fear that his presence occasioned any inconvenience to his entertainers. Nor was Hugh the only giver of spiritual food. Putting aside the rich gifts of human affection and sympathy, which grew more and more pleasant, I can hardly use a stronger word yet, to Hugh every day many things were spoken by the simple wisdom of David, which would have enlightened Hugh far more than they did, had he been sufficiently advanced to receive them. But their very simplicity was often far beyond the grasp of his thoughts, for the higher we rise, the simpler we become, and David was one of those of whom is the kingdom of heaven. There is a childhood into which we have to grow, just as there is a childhood which we must leave behind, a childlikeness which is the highest gain of humanity, and a childishness from which but few of those who are counted the wisest among men have freed themselves in their imagined progress toward the reality of things. This ends chapter 6.